Imagine walking into a courtroom like you own the place, laughing at the judge while you talk down to everyone around you, all because you think your family's wealth shields you from any consequences. That was exactly the attitude of Victoria Ashford Sterling, the wife of tech billionaire Marcus Sterling, when she walked into Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom. Victoria was convinced that her husband's billions and their name alone would buy her freedom. But what she didn't know was that Judge Caprio isn't interested in wealth or privilege. In his court, everyone is equal under the law. The scene was set for a showdown, one that would soon reveal to Victoria just how wrong she was. This wasn't going to be just another case. It was going to be a reality check like no other, a moment that would shake her entitlement to the core. As Victoria entered the courtroom, the doors swung open with a sense of grandeur. Her every move seemed choreographed, as though she was stepping into a place where she was destined to reign. Her outfit screamed wealth. A cream-colored Chanel suit that likely cost more than most people's monthly rent, and a Hermes Birkin bag swinging from her arm worth more than some people's yearly salary. Diamond bracelets glistened on her wrists, catching the fluorescent lights of the courtroom with every move she made. It was the kind of entrance that made heads turn, the kind that said, "I belong here and everyone else doesn't." Yet there was something that caught everyone off guard: her complete lack of awareness. Victoria, with her sunglasses perched firmly on her face, despite being indoors, didn't care to acknowledge the people around her. As she strolled confidently to her seat, she pulled out her phone and continued her conversation as if she was walking through a luxury boutique, not a court of law. "Darling, I can't talk right now. I'm dealing with this ridiculous legal theater," she said dismissively, not even pausing to look at anyone around her. "Just confirm with the caterer that the Belgian chocolate fountain is in order. The Swiss one was a disaster last time." The people in the gallery exchanged looks, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others muttering under their breath. It was the kind of arrogant, entitled behavior that you'd expect from someone who believes that rules simply don't apply to them. But what Victoria didn't realize was that Judge Caprio had seen it all. In his courtroom, no one, no matter how rich or powerful, was above the law. He remained calm, watching her with a sharp gaze, his eyes narrowing just slightly. His job was to see past all the pretense and find the truth. And this case was about to test him in ways he hadn't expected. When Victoria finally made her way to the defendant's table, she casually threw her phone onto the table without so much as a glance toward Judge Caprio or anyone else in the room. Her lawyer, Martin Whitmore, a well-dressed man with a nervous air about him, stood beside her, whispering in her ear. She waved him off impatiently, as if his words were as irrelevant as the proceedings themselves. Judge Caprio's voice broke the silence with a calm authority. "Mrs. Ashford Sterling, welcome to my courtroom. Please silence your phone and give this case your full attention." Victoria glanced up for the first time, offering a smile that was more condescending than genuine. "Your Honor," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm, "is that what I call you? I'm sure we can resolve this quickly. What's the damage?" She waved her hand dismissively, as if asking for the price of a small inconvenience. 5,000? 10,000? My assistant can wire it over right now." The room went completely silent. It was as if the air itself had frozen. Even the bailiff, who had seen his fair share of rude defendants, raised an eyebrow. Judge Caprio didn't flinch. He simply looked at Victoria with a calm, unwavering gaze. "Mrs. Ashford Sterling," he said slowly, his tone steady but firm, "this is not a negotiation. You're here for serious charges, not a transaction. You are here to face the law." Victoria laughed lightly, the sound of it echoing in the otherwise quiet courtroom. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I think you're overcomplicating things," she said, unbothered. "My husband donates more to this city than the entire courthouse is worth. Surely we can handle this more practically." The gallery gasped, stunned by her lack of regard for the law, but Judge Caprio remained composed. He wasn't going to let her dismiss the charges with money or privilege. The silence in the room deepened as the bailiff stepped forward and read the charges aloud. Victoria Ashford Sterling was facing serious accusations, and she couldn't simply laugh her way out of them. But this was just the beginning. As the charges are laid out, Victoria's true character will be revealed, and Judge Caprio is about to teach her a lesson she'll never forget. Stay tuned for what happens next. As Judge Caprio continued, his calm demeanor didn't waver despite the clear tension in the courtroom. "Mrs. Ashford Sterling," he said with precision, "you are charged with the following. Count 1, leaving the scene of an accident. Count 2, failure to render aid. Count 3, attempted obstruction of justice. And Count 4, intimidation of a witness." Victoria sat, seemingly unfazed, and examined her perfectly manicured nails with an air of boredom, as if she were sitting at a spa, not in the middle of a criminal trial. Her lawyer, Martin Whitmore, shifted uncomfortably beside her, glancing nervously between his client and the judge. But Victoria remained unbothered, flipping through the contents of her phone as if the entire courtroom drama was beneath her. Judge Caprio's voice broke the stillness once again. "Mrs. Ashford Sterling, do you understand the charges against you?" Victoria looked up, offering a half-smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course, Your Honor," she replied with a lazy wave of her hand, clearly uninterested in the gravity of the situation. "But really, this is all much ado about nothing. I barely tapped that car. It's just a minor fender bender. The real issue here is how people like me are being treated for these trivial matters." The courtroom audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One elderly woman in the back shook her head as she whispered to her neighbor, clearly dismayed by the young woman's attitude. Meanwhile, the bailiff, who had been through his fair share of difficult defendants, raised an eyebrow at Victoria's dismissive tone. Judge Caprio, however, didn't let her remarks pass. "You may call it a minor fender bender, Mrs. Ashford Sterling, but the person you hit, Maria Gonzalez, is a 58-year-old hospice nurse. She was rushing to the aid of a dying patient who specifically requested her presence. What you failed to understand was that this wasn't just a small incident. You struck a human being, and you left her injured on the side of the road." Victoria's smirk faltered for a moment, but only for a fraction of a second. She quickly recovered and leaned back in her chair, unimpressed. "I'm sorry, but that doesn't change anything. People get hurt in accidents all the time. My insurance will cover it." Judge Caprio's eyes narrowed slightly as he absorbed her words. He had heard excuses before, but something about Victoria's entitlement struck him deeply. "Your insurance doesn't excuse your behavior, Mrs. Ashford Sterling," he replied with controlled authority. "What matters is the way you handled the situation. You fled the scene without offering help, and when you were confronted by the security guard, you tried to use your husband's name to intimidate him into doing your bidding." Victoria's eyes flashed with a hint of irritation, but she quickly regained her composure. "My husband is Marcus Sterling, Your Honor. He's a man who built this city. If I wanted something fixed, I'd use the resources at my disposal. The world doesn't work the way you seem to think it does. Money and influence, these are the tools that get things done." The entire courtroom went silent. Judge Caprio took a slow breath, trying to keep his emotions in check. "Let me make this clear to you, Mrs. Ashford Sterling," he said, his voice cold and firm. "Your husband's money, your family's influence, it means nothing in my courtroom. In here, the only thing that matters is your actions, your respect for the law, and the lives you impact. And right now, you're being held accountable for not taking responsibility for yours." Victoria scoffed under her breath, not taking him seriously. "I don't see why we're making a federal case out of this. All I did was make an offer to resolve the situation quietly. She didn't want that, so I don't know why I'm even here." "Because you left the scene of an accident, Mrs. Ashford Sterling," Judge Caprio retorted, his patience beginning to wear thin. "You didn't stop to check on the woman you hit, you didn't call for help, and you certainly didn't report the accident. Instead, you attempted to buy your way out, and when that didn't work, you resorted to threats and intimidation. That's not how things are handled in this court. And that's not how things are handled when you're dealing with human lives." Victoria's expression hardened. "I don't need this. I don't need to be lectured like a child," she muttered, her voice tinged with frustration. "I offered a reasonable settlement. I offered money, and she turned it down." Judge Caprio remained unshaken by her outburst. You call it a reasonable settlement, Mrs. Ashford Sterling, but you were trying to buy your way out of trouble. You were using your wealth and influence to sidestep the law. Money doesn't make everything go away, and that's something you're about to learn. At that moment, the bailiff stepped forward, holding a security tape in his hands. Your Honor, the footage from the parking garage is ready. Play it. Judge Caprio ordered, his voice stern. The video played across the courtroom monitors, showing the exact sequence of events: Victoria's reckless driving, the impact with the delivery van, and her subsequent actions. As the footage unfolded, the audience sat in complete silence. Victoria, in her haste, had barely tapped the vehicle. The courtroom was silent as the footage played on the large monitors. The grainy black and white security tape showed the moment of impact in startling clarity. Victoria's white Range Rover backed out of the parking spot with alarming speed, far exceeding the safety limits for a confined garage. The collision with the blue van rocked the vehicle, visibly damaging it. Victoria stepped out of her car to inspect the damage, casually running her hand along the scrape on her bumper. Her face, even the grainy footage, showed irritation, as if this minor inconvenience was something beneath her. The van's door opened, and Maria Gonzalez, the woman Victoria had hit, emerged slowly. She held her side in pain, and her body language was unmistakable. She was trying to convey that she was injured. She walked toward Victoria, presumably to check if she was okay and to exchange details. But instead of offering assistance, Victoria reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick stack of cash. She offered it to Maria in an attempt to resolve the matter quietly. But when Maria refused, Victoria's demeanor changed instantly. With a dismissive flick of her wrist, Victoria shoved the cash back in her purse and turned to walk away, leaving Maria standing in the parking lot, clutching her side in pain. Without another word, she drove off. The entire courtroom was left in stunned silence as the video finished playing. The tension in the air was palpable as everyone took in what they had just witnessed. Victoria Ashford Sterling had left an injured woman in her wake, attempting to silence her with money and then abandoning her as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience. Judge Caprio leaned back in his chair, his gaze fixed intently on Victoria, who now looked a little less confident. Her shoulders were tense, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something resembling discomfort in her eyes. Well, Mrs. Ashford Sterling, Judge Caprio's voice cut through the stillness. Do you still maintain that this was just a minor parking mishap? Victoria hesitated, her usual defiance momentarily slipping. But with a swift recovery, she straightened her back, her chin tilting slightly as if she were the one in control. That video doesn't show the whole story, she said quickly, her voice louder now, trying to regain some semblance of authority. I was rushed. I had to get to a very important event. This whole thing is being blown out of proportion. I offered her money. What else does she want? Judge Caprio, ever composed, let her words hang in the air for a moment. What you offered, Mrs. Ashford Sterling, was an attempt to buy your way out of accountability. You hit someone, you left them there injured, and then you tried to manipulate the situation with money. That is not making it right. That's avoiding responsibility. Victoria clenched her fists in her lap. I didn't need to be lectured. I offered a solution. She was just being difficult. She muttered under her breath, though her words were louder than intended. Judge Caprio gave her a long, steady look before continuing, his voice unwavering. Mrs. Ashford Sterling, your attempt to buy your way out of this case is not the solution here. The law is not for sale, and neither are the consequences of your actions. Now, let's hear from the next witness. The tension in the room only grew as the next witness, Robert Chun, the head of security at the parking structure, was called to the stand. He stood and was sworn in, his face weathered from years of working long shifts. His testimony would reveal more about the aftermath of Victoria's actions. Mr. Chun, Judge Caprio asked, his tone professional. You were on duty when the incident occurred. Can you tell us what happened when you arrived on the scene? Robert took a deep breath before responding. I arrived 3 minutes after the incident, he began, his voice steady. Miss Gonzalez was on the phone with emergency services. She was clearly in pain. I approached to offer help and gather information for the incident report. That's when Mrs. Ashford Sterling came back to the scene, about 40 minutes after she had fled. The courtroom was silent, as everyone waited for him to continue. What did she say when she returned? Judge Caprio asked. Robert glanced briefly at Victoria before answering. She asked if anyone had filed a report. I told her that the injured party had spoken to the police and that I had provided them with the security footage. She got upset, very agitated, and then she said, and I quote, "Do you know who my husband is? Marcus Sterling owns half this city. If you file that report, I'll have your job by morning." Victoria's face flushed crimson, and her breathing quickened. "That's a lie," she spat, her voice loud enough to rattle the walls. "I never said that." The tension in the room was palpable. The bailiff immediately intervened, raising his hand for silence. The judge turned his gaze to Victoria. "Mrs. Ashford Sterling," he said with quiet authority, "do you still maintain that Mr. Chun is lying?" Victoria's jaw clenched, and she opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. She sat back down, the weight of the testimony pressing on her. It was becoming clear that her influence. The courtroom was tense, the silence so thick it felt as though the air itself was waiting for the next words to come. Victoria Ashford Sterling sat rigidly at the defendant's table, her composure faltering for the first time since she had entered the courtroom. As Judge Caprio looked at her, the weight of the moment was not lost on anyone present. The courtroom had been filled with whispers and murmurs, but now all attention was focused on the judge, whose calm presence seemed to carry an invisible weight of authority. "Mrs. Ashford Sterling," Judge Caprio began, his voice deliberate, "we've heard testimony from witnesses, seen the footage, and we've listened to your attempts to dismiss your actions. But there's one thing that's abundantly clear now. You've refused to take responsibility for your behavior." Victoria's jaw clenched, but she held her tongue, her eyes flickering to her lawyer, who sat beside her, clearly looking for a way to shift the conversation or defuse the situation. Judge Caprio raised a hand slightly, signaling for silence. His gaze remained fixed on Victoria. "You've used your wealth and status to try to avoid accountability, Mrs. Ashford Sterling. But as you've seen today, money cannot buy you out of this court's jurisdiction, and your family's influence won't protect you here. The law and justice do not care who your husband is or how many millions he's donated. In my courtroom, there are no exceptions." Victoria's face was flushed with indignation, and she finally stood up, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. "This is ridiculous. You're treating me like a criminal for a small accident. This whole thing is a joke. It's not like I meant to cause any harm. I tried to handle it privately, but no, she had to escalate it by calling the police." Judge Caprio's expression did not shift. "You don't get to decide how situations are handled, Mrs. Ashford Sterling," he responded, his voice unwavering. "You don't get to simply throw money at problems and walk away. You left the scene of an accident. You failed to render aid. You made an attempt to silence the person you harmed with money. And when confronted with the consequences, you tried to use threats to escape them. That is not how justice works." The room grew quieter as the judge's words hung in the air, resonating with everyone who had witnessed the proceedings. "Now, Mrs. Ashford Sterling," Judge Caprio continued, "we also have your interactions with the staff who serve you, people who have been kind enough to give their testimonies. We've heard how you treat them, how you use your wealth to diminish their dignity. You threaten them when they're doing their jobs, expecting to be treated as a queen simply because of your last name." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "This isn't a simple parking incident. It's about character. It's about showing respect to the people around you, to the world, to the laws that govern us all." Victoria stood motionless, her face slowly turning from red to pale as the full weight of what she had done came crashing down on her. She opened her mouth to speak again, but nothing came out. Judge Caprio wasn't done yet. "Now that you've had the chance to display your true character in this courtroom," Judge Caprio said, "it's time for me to deliver my ruling." He took a deep breath, then delivered the sentence with a finality that was impossible to ignore. "Mrs. Ashford Sterling, for your actions, you will pay a fine of $15,000. This will go directly to Maria Gonzalez for her medical expenses, lost wages, and the damage to the vehicle she was driving. You will also have your driving privileges suspended for 18 months. That's right, Mrs. Ashford Sterling, 18 months. You will not operate any vehicle during this period. You will use public transportation, just like the rest of us. Victoria's mouth dropped open, and her eyes widened in shock. What? 18 months? I can't. This is absurd. Judge Caprio raised his hand for silence once again. You'll use the buses and trains that millions of Americans rely on every day. You'll see what it's like to live in a world where people aren't treated like invisible servants, but as equals. This is the world you've dismissed for too long. And perhaps, just perhaps, this will be the lesson that changes your perspective. Victoria's face flushed with embarrassment as the words hit her like a slap. She opened her mouth to argue, but no words came out. Judge Caprio wasn't finished yet. Additionally, he continued, I am ordering you to perform 200 hours of community service, working with those who have been invisible to you for so long. You will help those who need assistance, people who work hard for a living, people who make our society function. You will spend your time working for others, not for yourself. Victoria opened her mouth again, but now it was clear she had no argument left. She was speechless, overwhelmed, and no longer the confident, arrogant woman who had walked into the courtroom moments before. The reality of her situation had set in. Finally, Judge Caprio said, his tone shifting from firm to final, if you attempt to use your family's influence to reverse this sentence, the penalties will double. The fine will increase to $30,000, and your driving suspension will extend to 3 years. Do you understand, Mrs. Ashford Sterling? Victoria sat down in her seat, defeated. Her shoulders sagged, and for the first time that day, she looked like she might actually understand the gravity of her actions. The silence in the courtroom was deafening as Judge Caprio's words echoed in the air. For a moment, it seemed as if the entire world had come to a standstill. Victoria Ashford Sterling, once so certain of her entitlement, now sat there, completely deflated. Her usual confidence had been stripped away, leaving only a woman forced to confront the harsh reality of her actions. Her eyes were downcast, her face flushed with humiliation, and her posture slumped. Judge Caprio took a moment to let the gravity of the sentence settle in. He didn't look at her with anger or satisfaction. His expression remained calm, focused on what needed to be done. After years of seeing the worst of humanity in his courtroom, this was nothing new to him. But even he knew that today's lesson was one that would leave a lasting impression, not just on Victoria, but on everyone watching. As the judge prepared to conclude the case, he addressed Victoria once more. Mrs. Ashford Sterling, let me be clear, he said, his voice steady but full of weight. Your wealth, your family's name, your status, none of that will change the fact that your actions have consequences. You may have thought that your money and influence could get you out of this, but today, in this courtroom, you've learned that no one is above the law. Victoria's lawyer, Martin Whitmore, stood up, his face pale and his hands trembling slightly. He glanced at Victoria, clearly unsure of how to proceed. He had represented wealthy clients before, but even he seemed taken aback by the finality of the judge's ruling. Judge Caprio turned to him, his gaze unwavering. Mr. Whitmore, you may be used in negotiating settlements and using influence to your advantage. But in this courtroom, we're not playing that game. Your client is being held accountable for her actions, just like anyone else. Victoria's lawyer opened his mouth, but no words came out. The reality of the situation was too much for him to deny. He slowly sat back down, defeated. Victoria, still reeling from the shock, looked up at the judge, her eyes now wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. Your Honor, she said, her voice shaking, I never meant for it to go this far. It was just a mistake, a simple accident. Judge Caprio's gaze softened slightly, but his voice remained firm. Mrs. Ashford Sterling, a mistake is when you drop a cup. A mistake is when you miss an appointment. What you did was far more than a mistake. You endangered someone's life, and then you tried to erase it with money and threats. That's not a mistake. That's a decision. Her eyes welled up with tears, but they didn't seem to be tears of remorse. They were tears of frustration and rage. I've worked so hard to get where I am. My family has done so much for this city. I deserve better than this. Her voice cracked as she spoke, the arrogance of her earlier behavior beginning to slip away. Judge Caprio looked at her, his expression unwavering. You deserve to be treated like everyone else. You deserve to face the consequences of your actions, just like any other person would. You think your family's wealth gives you the right to bypass responsibility, but you're learning today that justice doesn't work that way. Justice doesn't care who you are or what you have. Victoria opened her mouth to argue again, but her lawyer quickly grabbed her arm, whispering urgently in her ear to remain silent. The judge wasn't finished, and she knew better than to challenge him further. Her pride, however, was still bruised. She wanted to fight back, but she had nothing left to say. The courtroom remained still, waiting for the final words to come. Judge Caprio looked at Victoria one last time, his voice growing even quieter, but still holding the authority that had defined him for years. You will now learn what it means to live without the privileges you've always taken for granted, he said. This is not about punishment. This is about teaching you that your actions have consequences. And it's time you learned that the law applies to everyone, regardless of their wealth or status. Victoria's face was pale now, the realization of her situation settling deep within her. She had spent her life using her status to manipulate situations in her favor. But today, she had learned the harshest lesson of all, that there was no amount of money or power that could shield her from the consequences of her actions. The bailiff stepped forward, his voice breaking the silence. The sentence stands as follows: a fine of $15,000 to be paid directly to the victim, Maria Gonzalez. A driving suspension for 18 months. 200 hours of community service working with those in need, especially those who have been overlooked by people like you. Victoria's face was ashen, her hands gripping the sides of the table as if she were trying to hold on to something, anything, to ground herself. I don't know how I'm supposed to do all of this, she muttered under her breath, the defiance gone from her voice. This is impossible. Judge Caprio leaned forward once more. Life isn't always convenient, Mrs. Ashford Sterling, and not everything can be solved with a check or a phone call. It's time you learn that, just like the rest of us. As the judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack, the sound reverberated through the courtroom, signaling the end of the trial. The room was filled with the soft murmur of people shifting in their seats, the weight of the sentence hanging heavily in the air. Victoria sat there for a long moment, stunned into silence. She had no idea what would happen next. She had no idea how she was going to deal with this newfound reality. But one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again. Will this harsh reality finally teach Victoria